Zara Kim has the steady hands of a surgeon and the debt of a dropout, working the morning shift at Grind Coffee while her medical school dreams slip further away each day. She knows exactly which customers take their espresso with a side of chest pain and which ones mask their anxiety attacks behind expensive business suits. But in Seoul's gleaming financial district, a black barista with a pre-med background is just another invisible face behind the counter. At 24, Zara balanced coffee orders with the weight of crushing reality. She had been 3 months away from her residency when her grandmother's stroke changed everything. The medical bills back home in Atlanta had consumed her savings, forced her withdrawal from Emory, and left her with $43,000 in student loan debt and a medical degree that would never exist. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun that somehow managed to look professional despite the steam and chaos of the morning rush, and her dark eyes held the kind of focused intelligence that most people never bothered to notice in someone wearing a coffee shop apron. Seoul had seemed like a fresh start when the English teaching program accepted her. Teaching by day, saving every one, dreaming of retaking the MCAT and finding a way back to medicine. Instead, the teaching position fell through 2 weeks after her arrival, and she found herself grateful for work at Grind Coffee, a sleek establishment in the heart of Gangnam that catered to investment bankers, tech executives, and the kind of people who spent more on a single cup of coffee than she made in tips all day. The morning rush was brutal and predictable. Zara moved through the familiar dance of grinding beans, steaming milk, and managing the endless line of caffeine-dependent professionals who barely glanced at her face. She had been working the shift for 8 months now, long enough to recognize the regulars, their preferences, and their problems. The woman in the Chanel suit had high blood pressure, evidenced by the slight tremor in her hands and the way she pressed her palm to her chest when she thought no one was looking. The young trader who ordered 5 shots of espresso before 10 a.m. was masking what looked like the early stages of a panic disorder. The pharmaceutical executive always requested extra sugar to counteract what she suspected was untreated diabetes. She noticed these things because old habits died hard, and her medical training had taught her to observe, assess, and care about the human condition even when the humans themselves seemed determined to ignore it. Not that anyone asked for her opinion or seemed particularly interested in her observations. She was just the barista, efficient and forgettable. The coffee shop itself was all marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Everything was precise, expensive, and sterile. The clientele matched the aesthetic, polished professionals who conducted business deals over Americanos and treated the staff like sophisticated furniture. Zara had learned to move through their world without disrupting it, to be competent without being noticeable, to blend into the expensive background while counting every tip toward her impossible goal of returning to medical school. Her shift started at 6:30 a.m., which meant catching the first subway train of the day and arriving at the shop while Seoul was still dark and quiet. By 7, the space would be filled with the urgent energy of people who controlled billions of won and believed their caffeine needs constituted actual emergencies. She had perfected the art of taking complex orders, executing them flawlessly, and accepting payment with the kind of professional courtesy that made her invisible while ensuring tips. This particular morning felt no different from the previous 212. The same customers ordering the same drinks, the same hurried conversations about market fluctuations and merger negotiations, the same casual dismissal of her presence while depending entirely on her competence. She prepared a complicated oat milk macchiato with precision, handed it across the marble counter to a woman who didn't bother with eye contact, and moved on to the next order. Around 9:15, her observational skills saved someone's life in the most mundane way possible. A middle-aged businessman in an expensive gray suit suddenly grabbed his throat, his face turning red as he gestured frantically at his espresso cup. The customers around him stepped back uncertainly, unwilling to get involved or possibly unable to recognize the obvious signs of choking. Zara moved without thinking, vaulting over the counter with surprising grace and positioning herself behind the man. She wrapped her arms around his torso, found the correct hand placement just below his ribcage, and delivered 3 sharp upward thrusts. A piece of pastry dislodged from his throat and hit the floor with a wet sound. The man gasped, coughed violently, and drew in several deep breaths while the other customers watched with the fascination of people witnessing something that could easily have been tragic. "Thank you," the man managed between coughs, his voice hoarse but grateful. "You probably saved my life." Zara smiled politely, helped him to a chair, and returned to her position behind the counter as if performing emergency medical procedures was simply part of her job description. Several customers stared at her with new interest, perhaps recognizing for the first time that the quiet barista possessed skills beyond espresso preparation. But within minutes, the incident faded into background noise, another small drama in the lives of people too busy to dwell on their own mortality. She finished her shift at 2 p.m., counting her tips with practiced efficiency while calculating how the day's earnings brought her marginally closer to her goals. $43,000 in debt. Grandmother's medical bills requiring monthly payments of $800. Rent on her tiny efficiency apartment consuming 60% of her income. The MCAT registration fee of $325 still beyond her reach. Every day was a complex equation of survival and hope, with hope losing ground steadily. She had been a good student, a dedicated pre-med candidate who understood human anatomy, pharmacology, and diagnostic procedures with the kind of intuitive grasp that distinguished competent students from exceptional ones. None of that mattered now while she cleaned espresso machines and smiled politely at people who saw her as a service rather than a person. But she still noticed things. Still observed the subtle signs of illness, stress, and physical deterioration that most people missed or ignored. Still felt the automatic concern for human welfare that medical training had embedded so deeply it had become instinctive. Tomorrow would bring another morning shift, another 8 hours of invisible competence, another small contribution toward an impossible dream. She gathered her things, hung up her apron, and prepared to navigate Seoul's efficient but crowded public transportation system back to her neighborhood. Another day survived, another set of problems postponed. Another step further away from the life she had planned and closer to accepting the life she was actually living. The man in the corner booth commanded attention without demanding it, a distinction Zara had learned to recognize during her months of observing Seoul's power elite. Lee Jin-hyuk sat with his back to the wall, positioned to see every entrance and exit, his presence creating an invisible perimeter of respect and wariness that other customers unconsciously honored by avoiding nearby tables. He was perhaps 38, Korean, with the kind of sharp, controlled features that suggested both intelligence and danger, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. 3 other men occupied the booth with him, but their body language made the hierarchy clear. They leaned forward when he spoke, waited for his responses, and handled their phones and documents with the careful deference of people whose livelihoods depended on his approval. The conversation involved numbers that made Zara pause in her coffee preparation, figures in the hundreds of millions, territorial discussions that sounded more like military strategy than business negotiation. She had noticed him the moment he arrived, not because he was loud or demanding, but because of how the entire cafe shifted around his presence. Other customers glanced at him with the mixture of recognition and unease that suggested reputation rather than celebrity. The staff served his table with extra precision, their movements careful and respectful. Even the background music seemed to lower itself respectfully when he spoke. His voice was low, measured, with the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without raising volume. Zara caught fragments of conversation as she moved between tables, references to shipping schedules, facility security, and personnel transitions that sounded far more complex than typical business discussions. The other men addressed him as Lee Sejangnam, a formality that emphasized respect and status. For nearly an hour, the meeting proceeded with clockwork efficiency. Documents exchanged hands, phones buzzed with confirmations, and decisions were made with the casual discussion of matters that clearly involved enormous sums and serious consequences. Zara refilled their coffee twice, each time noting how Lee Jin-hyuk's dark eyes tracked every movement in the cafe with systematic precision, cataloging faces and exits with automatic vigilance. The collapse happened without warning and with terrifying speed. Jin-hyuk had been mid-sentence, discussing quarterly projections with one of his associates, when his words simply stopped. His face went pale, not the gradual drain of someone feeling ill but the sudden, stark whiteness of a medical emergency. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the expensive fabric of his shirt as his breathing became rapid and shallow. "Something's wrong," one of his men said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Jin-hyuk tried to respond, but could only manage a strangled sound as his breathing became increasingly labored. He shifted forward in the booth, his controlled posture collapsing as his body began to shut down. The color drained completely from his lips, and his eyes widened with the recognition that something was catastrophically wrong. The cafe erupted in controlled chaos. His associates stood quickly, their own faces reflecting panic as they watched their apparently invincible leader struggle for breath. Other customers turned to stare, some reaching for phones, others simply frozen by the sudden medical drama unfolding in their peaceful morning routine. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, though Zara couldn't identify the voice through the rising noise. She was already moving, her medical training overriding every other consideration. From across the cafe, she recognized the signs that others missed, the specific combination of symptoms that pointed to a life-threatening condition requiring immediate intervention. Jin-hyuk wasn't having a heart attack or choking, though both would have been serious enough. His breathing pattern, skin color, and the way he pressed his hand to his chest indicated something far more dangerous. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating around the heart, compressing it, preventing it from beating effectively. Without immediate decompression, he would die within minutes. She reached the booth as Jin-hyuk slumped against the leather seat, consciousness fading rapidly. His associates backed away uncertainly, torn between their obvious concern and their complete inability to help. The rest of the cafe watched with the fascination of people witnessing something that was clearly serious but beyond their understanding or capability. "Move," Zara said simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what was happening. The men stepped aside without question, recognizing competence when they encountered it. Zara knelt beside Jin-hyuk, her hands already moving to assess his condition with professional precision. His pulse was rapid and weak, his breathing shallow and ineffective, his skin cold and clammy. Classic signs of cardiovascular collapse due to cardiac compression. She had perhaps 3 minutes before brain damage, 5 before death. The ambulance would take at least 8 minutes to arrive, assuming someone had actually called and provided accurate location information. He would be dead before professional help reached him unless she acted immediately with whatever resources the cafe could provide. "What's happening to him?" one of the associates demanded, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Cardiac tamponade," Zara replied without looking up, her hands already searching through her mental inventory of available supplies. "His heart is being compressed by fluid accumulation. I need to decompress it immediately, or he'll die." She looked around the cafe quickly, cataloging potential equipment. Kitchen knives, too crude and dangerous. Serving spoons, wrong angle. Then she spotted what she needed, a metal cocktail stirrer from behind the bar, thin enough for precision, long enough for access, sterile enough for emergency use. "Hold him steady," she instructed the nearest associate, who complied immediately despite his obvious confusion about taking orders from a barista. Zara positioned herself with practiced efficiency, locating the precise intercostal space where needle decompression would be both safe and effective. She had performed this procedure exactly 3 times during her medical training, always under supervision, always with proper equipment, never with improvised tools in a coffee shop while a man's life hung in the balance. She sterilized the metal stirrer quickly with hand sanitizer, positioned it carefully below Jin-hyuk's left collarbone, and inserted it with steady precision through skin, muscle, and into the pericardial space surrounding his heart. The resistance was exactly what she expected, familiar from her training despite the unconventional circumstances. The moment she achieved proper placement, fluid began draining around the makeshift catheter. Jin-hyuk's breathing immediately improved, color returning to his face as his heart regained the ability to beat effectively. His eyes fluttered open, confusion replacing the panic that had dominated his features moments before. The cafe had gone completely silent, every customer and staff member frozen by the surreal medical drama they had just witnessed. Zara maintained pressure on the improvised catheter, monitoring Jin-hyuk's vital signs with automatic precision while her own heart pounded from the adrenaline of emergency intervention. "You're going to be okay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. "The ambulance is coming. I've decompressed the fluid around your heart, but you need immediate hospital treatment." Jin-hyuk's eyes focused on her face with surprising clarity for someone who had been dying moments earlier. He studied her features, her steady hands, the blood on her coffee shop apron where emergency medicine had collided with minimum wage employment. His voice, when he finally spoke, was weak but absolutely clear. "You saved my life." The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later, the paramedics taking control with professional efficiency while expressing amazement at the field treatment they encountered. Zara explained the procedure quickly and precisely, her medical terminology and clinical accuracy earning immediate respect from the emergency responders who recognized trained competence despite her civilian clothes. As they transferred Jin-hyuk to the stretcher, his eyes found hers one final time. The expression on his face was no longer confusion or gratitude, but something far more intense, a recognition that went beyond appreciation for life-saving medical intervention. He had seen her competence, her courage, and her willingness to risk everything to save a stranger. In his world, such qualities were rare and valuable beyond measure. The ambulance disappeared into Seoul traffic, taking Lee Jin-hyuk toward advanced cardiac care, while leaving behind a cafe full of stunned witnesses and one barista covered in blood, wondering what had just happened to her carefully invisible life. 3 days later, Zara stood behind the familiar marble counter attempting to convince herself that performing emergency cardiac surgery with a cocktail stirrer had been some kind of adrenaline-fueled hallucination. The cafe had returned to its normal rhythm of expensive coffee and quiet desperation, though she noticed customers still glanced toward the corner booth where a man had nearly died before their eyes. Management had posted a small notice about the medical emergency, praising their staff's quick response while diplomatically omitting the details that might discourage future business. She prepared the morning orders with mechanical precision, grateful for the mindless routine that kept her hands busy and her thoughts occupied. Every few minutes someone would approach with questions about the incident, their curiosity barely masked by expressions of concern. Had she really saved someone's life? Or had she learned to do that? Was it true the man was someone important? She deflected these inquiries with polite vagueness, unwilling to discuss what felt increasingly surreal with each passing hour. The story had made local news, though the reports were carefully sanitized. Businessman suffers medical emergency at upscale cafe, saved by quick-thinking employee. No names, no details, no mention of improvised surgical procedures or the fact that she had quite literally held a stranger's life in her hands using equipment designed for mixing martinis. Just another feel-good story about helpful service workers, forgotten as quickly as consumed. Zara preferred the anonymity. She had enough complications in her life without becoming Seoul's emergency medical celebrity, and she certainly couldn't afford the attention that might come from questions about her background, her qualifications, or her current immigration status. Better to let the incident fade into urban legend while she focused on the practical realities of rent, debt, and survival. What she didn't know was that 15 kilometers across the city, Lee Jin-hyuk was conducting the most thorough investigation of her life from his bed in a private medical facility that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. The cardiac specialist had confirmed her field diagnosis with impressed admiration. Pericardial tamponade, successfully decompressed through emergency needle thoracentesis performed with remarkable precision under impossible circumstances. The attending physician had spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about the procedure, unable to quite believe that someone without medical credentials had executed such advanced emergency intervention with improvised equipment. Jin-hyuk listened to these medical assessments with growing fascination. He had been saved not by luck or coincidence, but by someone who possessed both the knowledge and the courage to perform complex emergency medicine under pressure. Such competence was extraordinary enough, but the fact that this person worked as a barista in a coffee shop suggested a story far more compelling than random heroism. Within 12 hours of regaining consciousness, he had deployed his most trusted resources to answer a simple question that was becoming an obsession. Who was she, and why was someone capable of emergency cardiac surgery serving overpriced coffee to investment bankers? The investigation revealed layers of tragedy and determination that impressed even someone accustomed to evaluating human character under extreme circumstances. Zara Kim, 24 years old, former pre-med student at Emory University with a 3.9 GPA and glowing recommendations from professors who described her as naturally gifted in clinical diagnosis. Forced withdrawal 3 months before graduation due to family medical emergency. $43,000 in student loan debt. Monthly payments of $800 supporting her grandmother's post-stroke medical care in Atlanta. The financial records painted a picture of someone living with mathematical precision on the edge of disaster. Every one accounted for. Every expense calculated against competing necessities. Every tip saved toward goals that remained perpetually out of reach. She earned just enough to survive while sending money home, with nothing left for luxuries like retaking the MCAT or returning to medical school. His investigators had been thorough but discreet. Her work schedule, her tiny efficiency apartment, her careful budgeting, her isolation in a city where she knew almost no one. They had even uncovered her original reason for coming to Seoul, the teaching position that had disappeared, forcing her into service work that wasted talents she had spent 4 years developing. Jin-hyuk studied these reports with the systematic attention he normally reserved for business acquisitions or territorial negotiations. Here was someone whose competence had saved his life, whose circumstances had trapped her in a situation that wasted extraordinary abilities, whose integrity had led her to sacrifice her own dreams for family obligations. In his world, such people were rare treasures, diamonds buried in circumstances that prevented them from shining. On her 3rd day back at work, the flowers arrived. 24 white orchids in an arrangement that cost more than her monthly rent, delivered during the morning rush with a card written in precise handwriting that simply said, "Thank you for giving me back my life." They filled the employee break room with elegant fragrance that seemed completely out of place among the industrial coffee equipment and scheduling notices. Her co-workers gathered around the display with excited speculation about secret admirers and wealthy suitors. But Zara recognized the gesture for what it was. Not romance, but acknowledgement. A signal that the incident 3 days ago had not been forgotten by the man whose life she had saved. The orchids were beautiful, expensive, and somehow ominous in their perfection. She worked through her shift with growing unease, hyper-aware of every customer who entered, every glance in her direction, every possibility that her carefully invisible life was about to become very complicated. The flowers seemed to watch her from their crystal vase, a constant reminder that someone with significant resources had decided she was worth remembering. At closing time, as she finished cleaning the espresso machines and preparing to lock up, Lee Jin-hyuk walked through the front door. He moved more carefully than she remembered, still recovering from major cardiac intervention. But his presence filled the empty cafe with the same controlled intensity that had made him memorable 3 days earlier. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed despite his recent medical ordeal, and his sharp features showed no trace of the vulnerability she had witnessed when he was dying in booth 7. "We're closed," she said automatically, though something in his expression told her he was not here for coffee. "I know," Jin-hyuk replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority she remembered. "I came to see you." He approached the counter where she stood with cleaning supplies still in her hands, studying her face with the systematic attention of someone evaluating something valuable and rare. His dark eyes missed nothing, cataloging her tired posture, her worn shoes, the careful way she held herself that suggested someone accustomed to being overlooked. "You saved my life 3 days ago," he continued, stopping just close enough to make conversation intimate without being threatening. "I wanted to thank you properly." Zara set down her cleaning cloth, unsure whether to feel flattered or alarmed by his presence in her workplace after hours. The cafe suddenly felt smaller with just the two of them, the empty space emphasizing his commanding presence and her complete lack of information about who he really was or what he wanted. Anyone with medical training would have done the same thing, she said carefully, unwilling to accept credit that might lead to complications she couldn't afford. "But you don't have medical training, do you?" Jin-hyuk observed, his statement carrying the weight of knowledge rather than question. At least, not officially. Yet you diagnosed cardiac tamponade correctly and performed emergency pericardiocentesis with improvised equipment. That requires years of study and considerable practical experience. The accuracy of his assessment made her defensive. She had been careful not to claim medical credentials she didn't possess, had deflected questions about her background, had tried to minimize the significance of what had happened. But this man had clearly investigated her actions with thoroughness that suggested resources and determination far beyond casual curiosity. I was pre-med, she admitted reluctantly, before I had to drop out. Jin-hyuk nodded as if confirming information he already possessed. Emory University. 3 months from graduation. 3.9 GPA. Professors described you as exceptionally gifted in clinical diagnosis. Zara's breath caught. He hadn't just investigated her actions. He had investigated her entire educational background with access to information that required serious resources and connections. This was not casual gratitude, but systematic evaluation conducted by someone with significant power and specific interests. How do you know all that? She asked, though part of her already understood that she was dealing with someone whose capabilities extended far beyond typical business operations. I make it my business to understand people who save my life, Jin-hyuk replied simply, especially when those people are clearly wasting extraordinary talents in circumstances that don't serve them well. He glanced around the empty cafe, taking in the industrial coffee equipment, the marble counters, the expensive setting designed to generate profits for people who would never remember her name or recognize her abilities. When his eyes returned to her face, she saw something that looked almost like disappointment at the waste of human potential. You're exhausted, he observed with clinical accuracy that matched her own diagnostic skills. Working double shifts, sending money home, counting every tip toward goals that remain perpetually out of reach. When did you last sleep 8 hours straight? When did you last eat a meal you didn't have to calculate against other expenses? His questions were too accurate to be speculation, confirming that his investigation had been thorough enough to understand not just her background, but her current circumstances. He knew about her grandmother, her debt, her careful rationing of hope against practical necessity. The realization should have been alarming, but instead it felt almost like relief to be truly seen by someone who understood the mathematics of her impossible situation. Jin-hyuk reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, placing it on the marble counter between them with deliberate precision. The paper was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that suggested serious enterprise and considerable resources. When you're ready to stop struggling, he said quietly, call me. I have a proposition that might interest someone with your particular combination of skills and circumstances. What kind of proposition? Zara asked, though she was already certain the answer would be both tempting and dangerous. The kind that solves problems, Jin-hyuk replied, stepping back toward the door. For both of us. He left without further explanation, disappearing into Seoul's evening traffic while she stood alone in the empty cafe, holding a business card that felt like a crossroads. She looked at the white orchids still fragrant in their crystal vase, at the marble counter she had been cleaning for 8 months, at the reflection of herself in the window that showed someone younger than her years but older than her dreams. The card was simple, elegant, with a phone number and nothing else. No company name, no title, no indication of what kind of proposition might solve the problems that kept her awake most nights calculating impossible equations of survival and hope. But she slipped it into her pocket anyway, already knowing that the choice between her current life and whatever this dangerous stranger was offering had been made the moment she saved his life with a cocktail stirrer in her bare hands. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday morning, typed in precise Korean characters that Zara translated with sinking dread. 30 days to pay 3 months of back rent or face immediate removal from her efficiency apartment. She stared at the official document while calculating figures that refused to add up to anything resembling hope. $2,400 she didn't have, couldn't borrow, and couldn't earn through coffee shop wages before the deadline. Her grandmother's medical bills had increased again, the post-stroke complications requiring specialized physical therapy that insurance covered partially and family covered desperately. The MCAT registration deadline loomed next month, requiring fees she had been saving toward for 8 months without making meaningful progress. Every financial crisis seemed designed to destroy the others, a cascade of impossible choices that forced her to abandon dreams in order to survive realities. She held Lee Jin-hyuk's business card for the 5th time in 2 weeks, running her thumb over the raised lettering while weighing pride against desperation. Calling him felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that her careful independence had been an illusion maintained through willful ignorance of how precarious her situation really was. But eviction would mean losing her work permit, her legal resident status, and any remaining chance of rebuilding the medical career that had once seemed inevitable. The call was answered on the second ring by a voice she recognized immediately. "Mr. Lee," she said carefully, "this is Zara Kim. From the coffee shop." "I've been expecting your call," Jin-hyuk replied without surprise, as if her desperation had been both predictable and planned for. "Are you free this evening?" They met at Mingles, an exclusive restaurant in Gangnam that required reservations months in advance and served food that cost more per plate than she typically spent on groceries in a week. The hostess led her through dining rooms filled with Seoul's elite, past tables where business deals worth millions were discussed over wine that she couldn't pronounce, to a private room that overlooked the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Jin-hyuk rose when she entered, his greeting formal but warm, his expensive suit somehow making her own careful dress feel shabby despite her best efforts. He ordered for both of them without consulting a menu, speaking to the server in rapid Korean that suggested both familiarity and expectation of perfect service. The wine he selected probably cost more than her monthly salary. "You look tired," he observed once they were alone, his dark eyes assessing her with clinical precision that reminded her uncomfortably of her own diagnostic training. "Financial stress tends to have that effect," Zara replied, unwilling to pretend this was a social dinner when they both understood she was here because desperation had overcome pride. Jin-hyuk nodded as if her honesty confirmed his assessment of her character. "Tell me about your current situation." Specifically, the request was direct enough to bypass polite evasion. She found herself explaining the eviction notice, her grandmother's escalating medical costs, the impossible mathematics of survival on service wages while supporting family obligations and maintaining educational dreams. He listened without interruption, his attention complete and somehow professional, as if her problems were data points in an analysis he was conducting. "What do you need," he asked when she finished, "to solve these problems permanently?" The question was so direct it caught her off guard. She had become accustomed to managing crises rather than solving them, to choosing which disasters to postpone rather than which dreams to pursue. The idea of permanent solutions felt almost fictional. $200,000, she said after quick mental calculation. "To clear my debt, cover my grandmother's care, pay for medical school completion, and have enough left for basic security." Jin-hyuk reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it on the table between them with deliberate ceremony. Inside were documents printed on expensive paper, contracts written in English and Korean that looked both official and binding. "I'm offering you $150,000 annually," he said with the calm precision of someone stating facts rather than making proposals. "Your grandmother's medical care will be covered completely through a private medical fund I maintain. All costs associated with completing your medical education will be paid directly to the institutions involved. You will have private living quarters on my estate, fully furnished and maintained, with complete privacy and security." Zara's breath caught as she processed figures that solved every financial problem she faced while creating circumstances she had never imagined possible. The amounts he was discussing represented more money than she had ever expected to control, offered with casual certainty that suggested such sums were routine for him. "What would I do to earn this?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would be both reasonable and dangerous. "You would serve as my personal medical provider," Jin-hyuk explained, his tone remaining businesslike despite the personal nature of the arrangement. "I require someone with your specific combination of medical knowledge, diagnostic skills, and demonstrated ability to perform emergency intervention under pressure. You would live on my property, ensure my health and medical needs are met, and provide similar services to my close associates as needed." The role description sounded almost legitimate until she considered the implications. His close associates were clearly not conventional business partners, and medical services in his world probably involved treating injuries that couldn't be reported to authorities. She would be trading her current struggles for a different kind of danger, one that offered financial security at the cost of complete dependence on a man whose true business remained deliberately vague. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly despite her uncertainty about whether she really wanted the answers. "My business involves certain risks," Jin-hyuk replied with careful precision. "People in my position sometimes acquire injuries that require immediate, discreet medical attention. You would be expected to provide such care without questions, without outside consultation, and with absolute confidentiality." The euphemisms were clear enough to confirm her suspicions without providing details that might implicate her in knowledge of specific illegal activities. He was offering her a position as a private physician to someone whose occupation involved violence, danger, and the kind of medical emergencies that couldn't be treated in conventional hospitals. "I would be completely dependent on you," she observed, testing the boundaries of what he was actually offering versus what he was demanding in return. "You would be completely protected by me," Jin-hyuk corrected, his emphasis shifting the power dynamic from dependence to mutual benefit. "In my world, loyalty is rewarded with security that extends far beyond financial compensation. Betrayal, however, results in consequences that extend far beyond simple employment termination." The threat was delivered with the same calm professionalism as the offer, making clear that accepting his proposition meant entering a world where the stakes were considerably higher than anything she had previously experienced. She would be trading precarious independence for luxurious dependence, uncertain struggle for certain danger. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked, though the eviction notice in her apartment provided its own deadline. 24 hours, Jin-hyuk replied, closing the portfolio and returning it to his jacket. "After that, the offer expires and my medical needs will be addressed through alternative arrangements." Zara stared at the city lights beyond the restaurant windows, seeing her reflection superimposed over Seoul's glittering skyline. She looked young, tired, and completely overwhelmed by circumstances that offered no good choices, only different varieties of compromise and risk. Behind her reflection, she could see Jin-hyuk waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to making offers that redefined people's lives completely. Her current path led to eviction, deportation, and the permanent abandonment of medical dreams that had defined her identity for most of her adult life. His path led to security, education, and the kind of medical practice she had trained for, albeit under circumstances that would bind her to someone whose business operated outside legal boundaries. She thought about her grandmother's medical bills, mounting monthly while insurance coverage decreased steadily. She thought about her student loans, compounding interest making the debt larger despite payments that consumed most of her income. She thought about the MCAT registration fee she couldn't afford, the medical school applications she couldn't submit, the residency programs that would never consider her candidacy while she remained trapped in service work. Most of all, she thought about the moment 3 weeks ago when she had held Lee Jin-hyuk's life in her hands, feeling the satisfaction of using skills she had spent years developing to save someone who would have died without her intervention. That moment had reminded her who she really was beneath the exhaustion and desperation of her current circumstances. She was someone trained to heal, capable of life-saving medical intervention, naturally gifted at diagnosis and emergency care. His offer would let her be that person again, practicing medicine at the highest level while solving every financial problem that had forced her away from her true calling. The price was moral compromise, personal dependence, and entry into a world where violence was routine and discretion was mandatory. But the alternative was abandoning medicine entirely, accepting defeat, and watching her dreams disappear while her family suffered from problems she lacked resources to solve. "I accept," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. "Your terms are acceptable, Mr. Lee." Jin-hyuk smiled for the first time since she had known him, an expression that transformed his sharp features into something almost warm. He raised his wine glass in a gesture that felt like both celebration and commitment. "Welcome to your new life, Zara Kim." I think you'll find it considerably more interesting than making coffee. 2 months after accepting Lee Jin-hyuk's proposition, Zara had established a routine that felt surreal in its luxury and purpose. Her private medical facility occupied an entire wing of his estate, equipped with diagnostic equipment that most hospitals couldn't afford and pharmaceutical supplies that suggested preparation for serious trauma care. She spent her mornings reviewing medical journals, her afternoons treating minor injuries and conducting health assessments for his associates, and her evenings studying for the MCAD retake that was now financially guaranteed rather than desperately hoped for. The estate itself was a fortress disguised as a palace, situated behind high walls in Seoul's most exclusive district with security measures that made government buildings seem accessible by comparison. Her living quarters were larger than most apartments, furnished with understated elegance that emphasized comfort over ostentation. Every morning, she woke to find fresh flowers, perfectly prepared coffee, and a schedule that respected her medical expertise while acknowledging her complete integration into Jin-hyuk's carefully controlled world. His associates visited the medical facility regularly, men with expensive suits and careful expressions who discussed their injuries with professional euphemisms that didn't quite hide the violent nature of their work. Knife wounds became cooking accidents, gunshot injuries were hunting mishaps, and facial trauma resulted from automotive incidents that never seemed to involve police reports. She treated them with clinical competence while maintaining the discretion that her position required, asking no questions while providing care that probably saved several lives. Jin-hyuk himself proved to be a patient unlike any she had encountered during her medical training. He submitted to regular cardiovascular monitoring with surprising compliance, followed treatment recommendations without argument, and discussed his health concerns with the kind of detailed honesty that suggested both medical sophistication and complete trust in her professional capabilities. The cardiac condition that had nearly killed him required ongoing management, daily medications, and lifestyle modifications that he implemented with systematic precision. More surprisingly, he had proven unexpectedly considerate as an employer and surprisingly gentle as a presence in her daily life. He respected her privacy, supported her continued medical education, and treated her with a combination of professional respect and personal warmth that made their unusual arrangement feel almost normal. Their conversations over dinner had evolved from formal status reports to genuine discussions about medical research, Korean culture, and the careful balance between healing and harm that defined both their professional obligations. The vulnerability exchange happened on a rainy Thursday evening in late autumn, when Seoul's early winter had driven them indoors to the library, where Jin-hyuk often worked on legitimate business concerns that balanced his less legal enterprises. She had been reviewing his latest cardiac monitoring results, noting improvements that suggested her treatment protocol was successfully managing his condition, when he asked a question that shifted their entire relationship. "Do you regret accepting my offer?" he said quietly, looking up from financial documents that involved sums she still found difficult to comprehend. The question surprised her with its directness and apparent concern for her emotional state rather than simple contractual compliance. She considered her response carefully, weighing honesty against diplomacy while studying his sharp features for clues about what kind of answer he actually wanted. "No," she replied truthfully. "I regret that circumstances made your offer necessary, but I don't regret accepting it. I'm practicing medicine again. My grandmother is receiving the best care available. I'm financially secure for the first time in my adult life." Jin-hyuk nodded as if her answer satisfied some internal evaluation, but his expression remained thoughtful in a way that suggested deeper concerns. He set aside his documents and moved to the window that overlooked the estate's extensive gardens, now dormant in preparation for winter, but still beautiful in their structured elegance. "My heart condition isn't genetic," he said without turning around, his voice carrying a weight that indicated significant personal revelation. "It developed after a childhood trauma that I've never fully processed medically or emotionally. My father's business partners decided that controlling his organization required eliminating his family. They succeeded with my parents and younger sister. They failed with me only because I happened to be at school rather than home when they attacked." Zara set down his medical charts, recognizing that he was offering her something far more valuable and dangerous than clinical information. Personal history, emotional vulnerability, and an explanation for the controlled intensity that defined his presence in every room he entered. I was 12 when I watched my family's house burn with everyone I loved trapped inside. Jin-hyuk continued, his reflection in the window showing an expression of carefully controlled pain. The trauma triggered stress cardiomyopathy that weakened my heart permanently. Every doctor since has told me that emotional stress could prove fatal, that I need to avoid situations that trigger the same physiological responses that nearly killed me as a child. The medical implications were clear and troubling. Stress cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome, could indeed prove fatal in cases where psychological trauma triggered severe cardiac dysfunction. His dangerous lifestyle, his high-stress occupation, and the constant vigilance required to maintain his position were all contraindicated for someone with his condition. That's why you need constant medical monitoring, she observed, understanding finally why someone with his resources had been willing to offer such extraordinary compensation for private medical care. It wasn't paranoia or luxury, but genuine medical necessity, driven by trauma, that made conventional healthcare impossible. Jin-hyuk turned from the window to face her directly, his dark eyes holding the kind of vulnerability that she suspected few people ever witnessed. In that moment, he looked younger than his 38 years, less like the powerful criminal leader who commanded instant respect, and more like someone who had spent most of his life carrying wounds that refused to heal properly. But it's also why I need you specifically, he said with quiet intensity. Not just your medical knowledge, but your steadiness under pressure, your ability to remain calm during emergencies, your natural instinct to heal rather than harm. When you saved my life in that cafe, you reminded me what it felt like to be cared for by someone who saw me as a person worth saving rather than a problem to be managed. The confession created an intimacy that transcended their contractual arrangement, shifting their relationship from employer and employee towards something deeper and more complex. Zara recognized that he was trusting her with information that could be weaponized against him, sharing emotional vulnerabilities that his enemies would exploit ruthlessly if they ever discovered them. Your heart is stronger than you think, she said gently, approaching him with the careful attention she would show any patient processing trauma. The monitoring shows significant improvement since you've been following my treatment protocol. But you're right about stress being dangerous. Your lifestyle involves constant triggers for the same physiological responses that damaged your heart originally. I know, Jin-hyuk replied, his voice carrying acceptance of medical realities that couldn't be changed through wealth or power. Which is why having you here, knowing that someone with your skills is immediately available if I need emergency intervention, allows me to function in ways that would otherwise be impossible. She reached out instinctively, her hand covering his where it rested against the window frame, offering the kind of human comfort that transcended professional obligations. He looked down at their joined hands with surprise, as if physical kindness was so rare in his world that even simple gestures felt extraordinary. The moment was interrupted by an urgent knock on the library door, followed by the entry of Kim Woo-jin, Jin-hyuk's head of security, whose expression indicated immediate and serious concern. Sajangnam, we have a situation, Kim said in rapid Korean before switching to English with obvious deference to her presence. The Hwang organization has been conducting surveillance on our medical facility. They've identified Dr. Kim as a potential pressure point. Jin-hyuk's entire demeanor shifted instantly from vulnerable to lethal, his earlier emotional openness replaced by the cold calculation that made him dangerous. Zara felt the change like a physical thing, a reminder that the gentle man who had just shared childhood trauma was also someone capable of eliminating threats with terrifying efficiency. What kind of surveillance? Jin-hyuk asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made people respond with immediate precision. Photo documentation of her daily routines, Kim replied, producing a tablet that displayed images taken with telephoto lenses from multiple angles around the estate. They've mapped her schedule, identified security vulnerabilities, and conducted preliminary assessments of her value as leverage against your organization. Zara stared at the photographs of herself entering and leaving the medical facility, walking through the estate gardens, studying in her quarters with lights visible through windows that she had never considered might be observed by hostile forces. The surveillance was comprehensive and clearly conducted by professionals who understood that her importance to Jin-hyuk made her a strategic target. Assessment of threat level, Jin-hyuk demanded, his medical concerns forgotten in favor of immediate security considerations. Active planning phase, Kim responded grimly. They're not simply gathering intelligence anymore. We intercepted communications indicating preparation for acquisition and leverage operations. They intend to use her against you within the next 72 hours. The clinical terminology couldn't disguise the reality that she had become a liability to the man who had saved her from financial ruin, that her presence in his world had created vulnerabilities that his enemies intended to exploit. She was no longer just his private physician, but a weapon pointed at his heart by people who understood exactly how to cause him maximum damage. The attack came 18 hours later, while Jin-hyuk was attending a business meeting across the city and the estate's security was focused on protecting his external movements rather than defending against internal infiltration. Zara was reviewing medical supplies in the facility when the lights went out, followed immediately by the sound of glass breaking and voices speaking in urgent Korean that she didn't need to translate to understand as hostile. She activated the facility's emergency protocols with the same calm precision she had used to save Jin-hyuk's life, with a cocktail stirrer, locking down medical equipment, securing pharmaceutical supplies, and triggering silent alarms that would bring security reinforcements within minutes. But minutes felt like hours when footsteps echoed through corridors that she had come to consider safe territory. The medical facility had been designed with multiple exits and defensive capabilities that she had never expected to need. She barricaded herself in the surgical suite, using equipment that cost more than most people's houses to create obstacles, while calling Jin-hyuk's emergency number with hands that remained steady despite her racing heart. "They're inside the medical facility," she reported when he answered on the first ring. "At least 4 men, armed, looking specifically for me based on their search pattern." Jin-hyuk's response was immediate and lethal. "Security is en route. Maintain defensive position. Do not engage directly. I'm coming." The next 12 minutes tested every aspect of her medical training and personal courage as she used diagnostic equipment to monitor the intruder's approach, pharmaceutical knowledge to create improvised defensive measures, and surgical precision to remain hidden while they searched systematically through her domain. When security finally arrived, the confrontation was brief, decisive, and resulted in the complete elimination of the threat through methods she chose not to witness directly. Jin-hyuk arrived 30 minutes later to find the medical facility secured, the intruders permanently neutralized, and Zara sitting calmly in her office reviewing the evening's events with the clinical detachment that made her extraordinary. He studied her composed expression, her steady hands, her apparent immunity to post-traumatic stress that would have incapacitated most civilians. "Are you injured?" he asked, his concern immediate and genuine despite the larger implications of what had just occurred. "No," she replied truthfully. "But I understand now why my position comes with the compensation it does. This wasn't random violence. They came specifically for me because they knew exactly how to hurt you most effectively." Jin-hyuk nodded grimly, recognizing that she had grasped the strategic implications of her integration into his world with the same sharp intelligence that made her exceptional at emergency medicine. She was no longer an employee who happened to live dangerously, but a permanent part of his organization whose safety was inseparable from his own survival. The elimination of the Huang organization required 48 hours of systematic efficiency that Zara observed from the secure comfort of the medical facility, while Seoul's criminal landscape underwent permanent restructuring. She monitored news reports that spoke vaguely of industrial accidents, shipping incidents, and unexplained disappearances among mid-level executives in legitimate businesses that served as fronts for less legal enterprises. Jin-hyuk coordinated these operations from his office with the calm precision of someone conducting routine business, speaking in coded language that transformed violence into spreadsheet calculations. He had mobilized resources that impressed even her growing understanding of his true capabilities. Phone calls to associates in different cities, meetings with men whose expensive suits couldn't disguise their obvious competence in matters involving permanent solutions to strategic problems, and financial transfers that demonstrated the kind of power that could reshape entire criminal territories through systematic application of overwhelming force. Zara spent the 2 days studying advanced cardiothoracic surgery techniques, while heavily armed security maintained constant vigilance around the estate. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was researching methods to save lives while the man she cared about was ending them with mechanical efficiency. But she had moved beyond simple moral calculations into the complex ethical territory where healing and harming served the same protective purpose. On the third morning, Jin-hyuk returned from his final meeting looking tired but satisfied in the way of someone who had solved problems permanently rather than temporarily. He found her in the medical facility reviewing cardiac imaging studies. Her attention focused on treatment protocols that would ensure his long-term health despite the stress his occupation inevitably created. "It's finished," he said simply, settling into the chair beside her desk with the careful movement of someone managing chronic pain. The Huang organization no longer exists as a functional entity. Their leadership has been permanently neutralized, their operations have been absorbed by more cooperative groups, and their interest in using you as leverage has been conclusively eliminated. Zara looked up from the medical charts, studying his sharp features for signs of injury or exhaustion that might require her professional attention. He appeared unharmed but weary, carrying the weight of decisions that most people couldn't imagine making, but that his world demanded with routine frequency. "How many people died because of me?" she asked, needing to understand the human cost of her protection, even though she already suspected the answer would be significant. 17, Jin-hyuk replied with clinical precision, treating her question as a request for accurate information rather than moral judgment. "All of them involved in planning or executing operations that would have resulted in your death, or worse. None of them innocent by any reasonable definition." The number was both smaller and larger than she had expected. Smaller because entire criminal organizations typically involved hundreds of people, larger because 17 individual deaths represented 17 families that would never be complete again. But these were people who had chosen to threaten her life as a method of attacking someone they considered an enemy, making their elimination a matter of self-defense extended through proxy violence. "I can never go back to normal life. Can I?" she observed, recognizing that the attack had transformed her from someone who worked in dangerous circumstances into someone whose existence created danger for others. Jin-hyuk reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it rested on the medical charts with surprising gentleness. The touch was warm, familiar, and somehow both protective and possessive in ways that made her pulse accelerate despite her professional composure. "Normal was never an option from the moment you saved my life," he said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers with intensity that went far beyond employer concern or simple gratitude. "You became essential to me that day, not just medically but personally. You reminded me what it felt like to be cared for by someone who saw me as worth saving rather than worth fearing." His confession shifted the atmosphere between them from professional to deeply personal, acknowledging feelings that had been developing gradually over months of shared dinners, medical consultations, and quiet conversations that revealed increasing emotional intimacy. Zara recognized that he was offering her something far more valuable than financial security or professional advancement. "I'm not just your doctor anymore, am I?" she said, understanding finally that their relationship had evolved into something that transcended contractual arrangements or employee obligations. "You're my heart's keeper in every sense that matters," Jin-hyuk replied, his voice carrying the kind of vulnerable honesty that she suspected few people ever heard from him. "You save my life every day through your medical care, but you also save my soul by giving meaning to power that would otherwise be empty. You make me feel human instead of monstrous." The emotional weight of his words created a space for her own confession, acknowledgement of feelings that she had been suppressing through focus on professional obligations and practical gratitude. But somewhere between treating his associate's injuries and managing his cardiac care, gratitude had transformed into something deeper and more complex. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying truth that felt both inevitable and surprising. "Not because you rescued me from financial ruin, not because you've given me everything I thought I wanted, but because you trust me with your vulnerabilities while respecting my strength. You make me feel like the person I always wanted to become." Jin-hyuk's response was immediate and physical, rising from his chair to close the distance between them while his hands framed her face with reverent precision. His kiss was gentle despite the intensity of emotion driving it, a claiming that felt mutual rather than possessive, an acknowledgement of connection that went beyond desire into territory that neither had expected to explore. "You're mine now," he breathed against her lips when they separated, his words carrying both declaration and question. "Not just my physician, but my partner, my equal, the other half of everything I've built and everything I want to become. And you're mine to heal, to protect, to love despite all the darkness," Zara replied, her acceptance carrying the same weight of commitment and recognition of shared future that transcended their individual histories. The possession declaration felt natural rather than controlling, an acknowledgement of mutual dependence and shared purpose that made their unusual beginning irrelevant compared to their chosen future. She belonged to him in the same way that he belonged to her, through recognition of compatibility that went beyond circumstance into fundamental understanding of who they were together. Jin-hyuk reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box that contained a ring designed with understated elegance that emphasized quality over ostentation. The diamond was flawless but not ostentatious, set in platinum that caught the light with subtle brilliance that suggested both wealth and refined taste. "Marry me," he said with quiet certainty, holding the ring between them like a promise of permanence that would formalize what had already become emotional reality. "Be my wife, my partner in legitimate medical ventures, my equal in everything that matters. Help me transform what I've built into something that serves healing rather than just power." "Yes," Zara replied without hesitation, extending her hand for the ring that represented not just commitment, but transformation of their entire relationship from employer and employee into true partnership. "I accept everything you're offering and everything you're asking in return." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been designed specifically for her hand, which she realized it probably had been given his systematic attention to details that mattered to him. The weight was substantial but comfortable, a constant reminder of promises made and futures secured through mutual choice rather than desperate circumstance. They spent the evening planning a future that combined his resources with her medical expertise to create legitimate healthcare enterprises that would serve his organization while expanding into conventional medical practice. Advanced surgical training at the best institutions in the world, private medical facilities that could handle both emergency trauma and routine healthcare, research funding that would advance cardiac medicine while serving immediate practical needs. By morning, contracts were being prepared that would establish her as co-owner of medical enterprises worth millions, partner in legitimate businesses that would transform criminal wealth into legal healthcare empire. Her grandmother would receive the best medical care available anywhere. Her family would be protected by security that extended across continents, and her medical career would develop along paths that most physicians could only dream about accessing. 6 months later, Dr. Zara Lee stood in their private medical facility conducting routine cardiac monitoring on her husband while reviewing applications for the Advanced Medical Fellowship program they had established at Seoul National University. The cardiac tamponade that had brought them together required ongoing management that she provided with expertise enhanced by additional training in cardiothoracic surgery that his resources had made possible. She had walked into a coffee shop with student loan debt and impossible dreams, serving overpriced beverages to people who never bothered learning her name. She had walked out of that life into something that exceeded every aspiration she had ever allowed herself to consider. The barista who saved a stranger's life with a cocktail stirrer had become the physician who healed hearts both medically and emotionally. Protected by power, she had helped transform from destructive into healing. Every morning she woke beside a man whose dangerous world had become her domain, whose criminal empire was being systematically converted into legitimate medical enterprise, whose love had proven as reliable as his protection. She was no longer struggling to survive, but thriving in ways that honored both her medical calling and her practical needs for security and purpose. In the quiet moments between emergency calls and routine consultations, she sometimes remembered the exhausted woman who had counted tips while calculating impossible equations of debt and hope. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime. someone who had existed before she understood that saving one life could transform two people completely, creating love from gratitude and partnership from protection in ways that made their beginning irrelevant compared to their chosen future together.